professor Duprè, il nostro discussant, il professor Alessandro Quattrone del CIBIO. Il professor Duprè è un filosofo della biologia che si è occupato molto di temi di maggiore attualità oggi, in relazione soprattutto al dibattito sulle scienze della vita, i loro rapporti, le loro implicazioni etiche, sociali, politiche e filosofiche. Questo credo che sia, I think this is your latest, most recent book published in Italy.
It's I'm afraid my only book.
Il suo libro Natura Umana, tradotto in italiano, perché la scienza non basta, che è naturalmente solo una delle tante pubblicazioni di Duprè. Io gli do subito volentieri la parola. Il professor Duprè parlerà lentamente in inglese e le sue slide sono state, come vedete, invece tradotte in italiano a beneficio di chi avesse difficoltà a seguirlo nella sua lingua.
Welcome. Thank you very much. I'll probably be better if I stand up. I must begin by apologizing for my linguistic deficiencies. You would not enjoy it if I attempted to speak in Italian, because you would certainly, however much it's hard to understand me in English, you wouldn't understand me at all if I tried that. I will try to speak slowly, but I guess maybe you should tell me if I'm going too fast, and then you have the dilemma that if I go any slower, it'll take longer. So I hope I'll find the right balance. I'll do my best. So, let me begin. Okay. And I'm a little bit awkward because my Italian is so bad that I can't read the slides that found across them. It's very kindly translated into Italian, so I have my English ones here. Okay, this is work on a theme that has really been my biggest philosophical interest for my entire philosophical career. And this is the question that I've put up here. How does one divide biology into discrete parts? So, there's just all this stuff out there. There's all this biological stuff. We can tell that we've got biological stuff, but we also want, if we're going to understand it or to study it, we have to carve it up into different bits. And I want to raise the question whether there's a unique way of doing this, to which I shall suggest a skeptical answer, and just talk a little bit about how we do it, how we think about carving up biological reality. There are two more familiar questions that I've actually myself spent a lot of time on in this area. One is how we take all the, supposing we know what the biological things, the organisms are, how do we classify them into species? And this is a very ancient debate that continues today, and one that I've spent some time on. Much more recently, there's been a question about genes, and again, I won't go into this, apart from just saying we're all familiar now with the idea of a genome, and we sort of think that whatever the genes are, they must be somewhere in the genome. But how we take a genome and find out what the genes are in it, it turns out to be an extremely difficult question that philosophers as well as biologists have been much interested in. Today, the question I'm more interested in is the question presupposed by the question about species, how we find the organisms in the first place, and whether indeed there's a unique way of doing that. And I should suggest, contrary to, I guess, what many people think, that there isn't. This isn't a problem that, as I say, has worried philosophers much. I think there's a famous quotation from the American jurist, Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart, talking about pornography. And he was asked to define pornography, and he said, well, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. I think that we often feel that way about an organism. So, an elephant walks into the room, and there's an organism, even if I can't define what an organism is. I actually suggest it's more complicated than that. Now, here's one way of approaching the problem. It's very uncontroversial, I think, to suppose that biological things form a hierarchy. The slide here mentions some of the things in the hierarchy. I don't suggest that this is by any means complete, just to get a sense. Little things are made up of, big things are made up of smaller things and so on, down to, I suppose, atoms or physical particles. The question that I want to consider as a theme throughout this talk is, one might think two ways about some of these higher level things. One might think of them as just associations of individual things that are really, in a sense, pursuing their own goals. Now that, of course, is a problematic notion, but I think it's one that we can make sense of relatively easily in biology in terms of theories of selection. They're the things that are kind of pursuing their own survival. And it may suit them to come together and cooperate for a bit, as long as they need to, but if they get a chance to go out on their own, they'll do so. Now, there are two areas where this idea has been very familiar. One is, I'm sure most of you have read some of Rich or familiar with Richard Dawkins' idea of the selfish gene. This is a very strange idea in a way, because you look at an organism that has a genome in all its cells, and you think it's part of the organism, and its job is to make the organism thrive. Well, Dawkins is suggesting that actually it's not quite true. All of these things are collaborating, and have to collaborate to some degree, but if they get a chance to do something that will benefit them in the long evolutionary run, then that's what you're likely to find. The other area in which, of course, this is most familiar, where the metaphor comes from, is humans. And we're often given to believe theories about humans that say, ultimately we're all self-interested. Ultimately, we're pursuing our own good. Now, it may suit us to be nice to people because they'll be nice to us and so on, but ultimately that's just a strategy for pursuing our own goals. Now, I just want to suggest quickly here, before I go further, this is, at least in both cases, a view that is specific to a particular area. If we look at the biological hierarchy, that's not an assumption we make. I don't think that my kidneys are competing with my liver to see which is going to do better. They're obviously not in a position to do that, but even if there was some way they could, we don't suppose they would. We think of them as part of a whole, and that their function is to contribute to the whole. So why would we think of little bits of the genome as competing with one another, rather than, like the kidney and the liver, just being part of the whole thing? As I'm saying, to have the hierarchy at all, to have the higher level things, we have to have a lot of cooperation. This is not to say there isn't competition. The question is where the competition comes, where the cooperation comes, and that isn't obvious. It's something we need to think about and investigate in particular cases. And I think we're often, driven very much in our thinking on this by the anthropocentric considerations that come out of the home of the metaphor. Selfishness is obviously a metaphor about humans. This tends to drive the way we think about some of these issues, particularly, obviously, the human issues. Okay. Now, I've actually probably said a lot of this. Some of you will be familiar with a famous quotation from my former Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, who once said, "There is no such thing as society." I want to, and this obviously following on from questioning this assumption of the complete ultimate selfishness of individuals, one of the things I want to conclude is that actually there's no reason to doubt that there is such a thing as society. Societies are part of the biological hierarchy, and they can be coherent parts to which the components contribute their as part of the functioning, just as my kidney contributes to my functioning. Not that that's the whole story, of course, but that that's to be part of the story. So, I want to, and I just want to contrast this with an idea in a lot of human biology that we encounter that is just self-evident that humans are ultimately selfish. So there's a whole intellectual industry of explaining why sometimes people seem nice, and so we talk about genetic connectedness. As if you coming out of the selfish gene theory, the idea I'm only really nice, I'm nice to my kids because they've got my genes. So it's sort of like being nice to myself. There is notions of reciprocity. I'm nice to you because I think you may be nice to me, and it's worth it on balance. And then there's a thought that maybe against our natural tendencies, we can almost kind of trick children into growing up nice by bringing them up in certain ways, and kind of, deceive. We can kind of habituate them to behave in certain ways. So strange, things that they do that seem not to do them any good, maybe we've just somehow persuaded them to do this. But there's generally a thought that, they might smarten up at some point and stop doing this. This is going to be unstable. So the thought is that altruism requires explanation. Why is this? Well, again, the assumption is because natural selection selected organisms that look out for themselves. But then I want to say, well, of course, that assumes we know what the organisms are, so we know what are the selective processes. And in fact, nowadays, there's a tendency to think many different things at different levels in the hierarchy may have been selected. So that, again, the problem where we find competition honed by natural selection and where we find cooperation may be just an open question that we just need to explore. Okay. And as far as this selfishness model, I just want to point out that there are two obvious challenges. One is just empirical. People are nice. It requires explanation. Not they're always nice, but they are sometimes. They like to, a common example that baffles economists. We tend to, leave tips in restaurants that we are just passing by and we're never going to come back to. Why on earth would we do that? Because there's no possibility of reciprocity. They're not going to do horrible things to our food the next time because we're not coming back. And just further on this is the thought that actually this is perhaps the selfishness idea is sort of ethnocentric, that Western culture has developed in the last few centuries with a very strong ideology of individualism that has made us think of ourselves as isolated individuals. But if we were to look not so much further back in history, or even at a few remnants of small cultures that still exist, we would find people who think quite differently, who actually think that the reason you act is for the social whole, and take that as obvious as some people take the selfishness assumption. Okay. And finally, then the other challenge, which is what I'm pursuing here, is the conceptual one, that it's somehow self-evident what the individuals that compete with one another are. So, I now move to biology, and I'll come back to humans at the end. And here's the general argument for the problematic nature of picking out organisms in nature. So what I want to do is say, first of all, let's assume, and I have to say because, as always in biology, whenever something seems at least straightforward and simple, people point out that it isn't so. So when I first wrote this paper, I said cells are the fundamental units that things are made of. And somebody immediately said there's a great debate in plant biology about whether cells are really what's fundamental or not. Well, at least perhaps not a great debate, but there are certainly people who think the concept doesn't work very well for plants or fungi. I think that I'll put that on one side. I don't think it's going to change my argument a lot. So what I want to look at, suppose, let's say cells are the fundamental units. Let's look at the different ways that they form wholes that we think of as organisms. And having looked at this, I want to reach a conclusion which I call promiscuous realism about individuals, or promiscuous individualism. And here I have to explain, this is a kind of internal reference. When I was working on species, I gave the name promiscuous realism to my view that there is no unique way of dividing organisms into species. So there are real units, but there are many units and they can overlap with one another and so on. So I just transfer the term to say, actually, and this is something that I certainly didn't realize when I was first thinking about these things, that actually we can be promiscuous realists about the individuals. That's to say, carving up biological stuff into organisms is not something that's uniquely determined by the way things are, or so I shall suggest. And this will suggest that there are further complexities to deciding what are the units of selection that may therefore be the centers of, if one wants to use the metaphor, selfishness. Just a word on cells. All organisms, I suggest, and here I just, with this little qualification I made, are composed of cells. Many, we tend to think, consist of independent cells. Cells are an attractive constituent to focus on because they do seem to have nice clear boundaries and a very integrated internal functioning. Not to say, of course, they don't interact, but so on. And I will put on one side a crucial question, because it's too big, about how we understand viruses and related things that are biological entities that are not cells. Now, I just say, because this is a fascinating topic, that I think that I hypothesize that as we find more out about viruses, whole notions about evolution and about classification, and in particular I'm involved in a project now on questioning the tree of life, these are going to be really shaken up, because I think what we're coming to see is that contrary to the idea of genes as things that live in individual organisms and pass on to their progeny, we live in a great flux of genetic material that comes in and out of our cells all the time and creates a much more complex picture. But that's just a little aside, because it's not central to this. For now, I will not talk about viruses at all. Anybody can, of course, ask me any questions, but okay. No, sorry. Okay. Now, here, in starting to talk about the different kinds of aggregations, I need to make a distinction and introduce a term which I think we need badly, which is the term macrobe, which is what is not a microbe. And I'll explain in a moment why this is so important. But for now, I just point out there's a traditional way of starting to classify the most fundamental level, thinking of single-celled and multi-celled organisms, I call microbes, or macrobes. And I just want to say, this is very simplistic. But one point that is crucial, and I'll just again explain this in a moment, is that nearly everything is microbes. So one of the ways, I think, to get the right biological perspective on things like us is to realize that we're a very unusual kind of organism. Most of the history of life is the history of microbes. Then there came about these strange things like us, and now they take up a lot of space and so on, but they're a very small number of organisms, at least as traditionally conceived. And let me next just follow up a little on this with the following thought. Okay, so here is a way some of you might have learnt basic classification in biology, maybe at school. I guess I would have done if I'd done any biology. Certainly that time. So there's 5 different kingdoms of animals, we used to think. So the animals, the plants, the fungi, then there are there's a distinction which I shall have to, I'm sorry to be kind of technical as I hope I'll get, there's a distinction between eukaryotes, which have a big kind of cell for those who are not biologists, and prokaryotes, which tend to have smaller cells, simpler cells, and protists are the eukaryotes that are single-celled, and so that's the same as are the other four categories. Monera, we tend to think of mainly as bacteria, are the prokaryotes, the simpler kind of cells, or at least we tend to think of them as simpler. Now, and I guess I just showed this because I like this. I found this in The Guardian, a newspaper in England, and I'm sorry, the horrible reproduction. That's my brilliant camera work. But the point I'm saying is this is supposed to be the history of life. It starts 600 million years ago. Life started about 3.5 billion years ago. And it has about 10 dinosaurs, one plant, which is about 2 centimeters on the picture, is actually a plant that's it's higher than any of the dinosaurs. And then we've got some mammals at the top. And I just want to, point out this kind of way we think of life as being macrobes, things like us. And actually, the reason we don't have the first 3 billion years is because they're only microbes and nobody cares about them. Right? Now, here is a sort of more modern view of life. And the point I want to make is, first of all, the eukaryotes, which make up 4 of the kingdoms we learnt about. I'm sorry, it's come out rather faint. But they're that little branch on the left. The biggest branch is the bacteria by some way. The Monera, as we thought of them, now consist of 2 of the branches of life because we now realize there was a major division actually before eukaryotes existed that carries on to this day between the bacteria and what we now call the archaea. So, as I say, Monera consists of 2 branches of the tree, and protists consist of most of the eukaryotes, and 3 of the kingdoms that I learnt about and would have learnt about in school are in this little corner of the eukaryote bit. So, so just again to get this, in terms of diversity as we now map it, we're a very small corner of diversity. We only happened very recently, and we're very spectacular and flashy, but we're kind of a kind of recent twist on biology. Okay, now this is a horrible slide, which I will pass over very quickly, and I will do so because I'm going to explain it in terms of some more picturesque style. But just to get a sense of what I'm saying, what I'm trying to do here is classify the ways that cells come together. Look at the different kinds of aggregations. And this is, again, the function of this is to problematize this notion that, we know one when we see one. To point out that cells, both different kinds of cells in terms of having different genomes, and different kinds of cells in sense of, so that's, my cells versus cabbage cells, and also my liver cells versus my kidney cells. So there are 2 ways that cells can differ within an organism, and I want to just look at the different ways that they do this. So let me just not worry about these categories, they're just an overview, and just go and move on to the pictures. Right. So this is what I take to be the simplest way that cells can be, entities can be made up of more than one cells. These are genomically similar and morphologically similar cells. So what we have here is little colonies of microbes. 3 of them because when you look for things like this, actually what you tend to find is things that exist in labs rather than in nature. So 3 of these are living Petri dishes in labs, 2 on the left and 1 on the top. The nearest I could find to something that's, that at least has a picture in nature was one here, which is a fungus that you hope doesn't live on your trees because it kills them. And here is a bacterium that you hope does live on your pea plants because they'll die otherwise. But so, and I would actually question whether these are kind of independent systems, but it's actually very hard to find something as simple as this that is a kind of colonial thing which is both genomically and morphologically homogeneous. Now the next, kind of thing that you might say is the next is a more complex kind of thing, are a very interesting set of very diverse things that exist mostly in sort of colonies of cells that form filaments and mats underground, or on top of the ground, in, I guess actually both the first two, and sometimes become morphologically diverse and form these fruiting bodies. And this ranges from a mushroom, which you might find interesting to eat, but I wouldn't recommend it, to actually a bacterium that does more or less the same thing, and this is a eukaryote that does the same thing. And one of the things about this is that it actually starts to problematize the microbe-macro distinction. On the whole, these things on the left we think of as microbes, and often they're free-living cells, but then they come together and form complex systems. This one, I say, lives most of the time as subterranean filaments, and then every now and again forms this rather flashy thing on the surface. Now the next thing, and these are my favorite, because the point I want to make with this slide is that one of the things that we've come to realize recently is that most of the things we call microbes don't actually live solitary existences as just wandering, lonely cells. Mostly they live in complex colonies, and mostly they live in colonies that actually include many different kinds of microbes. The one on the left, which I guess we're all familiar with, at least we've managed to, unless we managed to avoid thinking about it, the ones that live on our teeth, there are about 500 different types of microbe in a typical dental plaque. And it's also a very fascinating system because if you change your diet, you'll change the makeup of your dental plaque. So for example, if you go on a low-carb diet, over about 2 weeks, you'll end up with a quite different constitution to your dental plaque that starts generating strange proteins like cadaverine and putrescine, oddly enough. But anyhow, that's by the way. Here is a quite different one that lives at Yellowstone Park, and actually the point I want to make with this one is that, that these systems of microbes can live in far more diverse environments than any traditional macro. And this is living in sort of sulfurous lakes at a very high temperature. Microbes have, I say, particularly when they have these collaborative systems, can live in the most amazingly diverse environments. And I read a wonderful description of one of these biofilms as you think of a kind of inner city, or sort of think of the sort of downtown area of a big city with great high-rise buildings of slime coming up in front of you and rivers going between them, and sort of stuff coming from one slime mountain to the next as microbes doing one kind of thing pass on their products to be processed by the next kind, and then there are adhering microbes that specialize in sticking onto the tooth, and so on. It's a very complex system. Now, Now here are kind of macrobes. Just a word about some of these. This one in the top right is this thing called in English the Pompeii worm. This is the highest, and here, by the way, by macrobe now, I simply mean anything that has eukaryotic cells, big complex cells, with diverse morphology, so different kinds of cells with more or less the same genome in them. But it also has other things. If you look at those little spikes, those are actually colonies of bacteria. Nobody is quite sure what they do, but the hypothesis is that this is what enables the Pompeii worm to live in the hottest environments of any macrobe. That as I said, microbes are very good at dealing with extreme conditions, and so this is probably something that enables the worm to live where it does. This is a squid that can see in the dark because it has colonies of bacteria that produce light, which is very useful because it lives in very deep water. The ones I guess I want to say more about are the two kind of my neighbours, as it happens. I just picked them that way. And particularly I like this. And I think here's just a different way of thinking about macrobes. And the cow is a very nice example. So just take the microbes point of view. So supposing you have, you're a bunch of microbes trying to digest grass. Well, it turns out the optimal thing, first of all, is have a series of grass digesting systems, and one of them does a bit of digesting, then the other one moves in and does a bit more, and you maybe have 4 lots of this, and then you've finished, and you've really finished getting as much energy as you can out of the grass. Now, there are 2 problems. One is keeping, so how do you move the next one in after the first one's left? And the second one is, even if you do that, when you've eaten all the grass, then what do? Do you just die? Well, obviously, if you're a microbe, what you do is you invent a cow, right? Because cow has a series of stomachs with different microbial communities in it. And what's more, when the cow has finished a bit of grass in one place, it's got a kind of crude sort of motor system, and it can go to another bit of grass and process that. So basically, it solves all the problems that you would have if you were a whole bunch of diverse microbes trying to eat grass. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's, a total, the selfish microbe view of evolution, but it's I think, a perspective that reminds us that a cow is not just a lot of cow cells, it's actually a very complex system which functions because it has all kinds of genomically different cells in it, not just morphologically distinct cells. It's a very complex system. Trees are another nice example, just representative of plants in general for this purpose. And what I think some of us maybe don't know, some of us forget about plants, is that, in a way, so much of the action happens underground. And what happens underground isn't just a little sort of tube sticking out sucking water in, it's actually massively complex systems of fungi and bacteria and so on, which break down the environment in the vicinity of the root and provide the nutrients that the plant needs. So, again, it's a very complex system. Now, what is particularly nice about this, though, is that it's becoming quite questionable how much you can break down plant communities into individuals, because, and this is, I got this lovely picture recently from Nature, because the fungal systems that that interact sometimes actually from inside the plant roots going out into the soil provide these nets of mycelia, that kind of fungal kind of networks that actually join up plants, and sometimes actually can apparently join up plants of different species, and what's more, can transfer nutrients from one plant to another. I mean, this is still somewhat controversial stuff, but it's starting to look as if plant communities really can interconnect in this way, so that the plant that's taller and taking the light may actually be feeding some of the plants that are shorter. Well, we know it does to some degree, but we call these parasitic plants. But it may be that that's just one way that it happens. It may be that there are connections between diverse plants underground through the fungal symbionts that make the whole system part of a complex, dare I say, organism. I have a worry here that I'm drifting towards Gaia, which is somewhere I'm very reluctant to go. But one has to follow things where they lead, and they probably don't go that far. Okay, so where are we? So finally, humans. And the first thing I guess I want to say, of course, is that humans are no different from other macrobes in this way, and things that not everybody is aware of, that 90% of the cells you walk around with are microbes that live mostly in your gut, but in your skin or your orifices, on your teeth, of course. And if you count genes rather than cells, it's 99% of the genes. There is now a human biome project, which is the successor to the genome project, that will try and track down the other 99% of the genes in the human system. And that these are not just, we once, I think, tended to think these are just nice environments and the microbes come and live in it. And we're increasingly realize that that's no more true for us than the cow, that actually they're part of the system, and the system would not function without them. They're essential for digestion, they're essential for our immune system, and actually, again, a hypothesis I have is we're going to find most of the immune system is the microbes. It's only backups, the stuff we know all the stuff about, is when things come through. But and they're essential for development. That actually genes interact between cells, human cells and microbial cells, and switch one another on and off, and the whole system is functioning as a whole. So here I want to, this is finally getting to the pluralism, what I call the promiscuous realism. I think the evolutionary human may actually be a different thing from the functional human. So that when we talk about evolution, we're interested in lineages of cells with the same genomes, or at least for some purposes. But when we talk about functioning, we typically have to look at a whole system, different kinds of cells, genomically as well as morphologically, that are what interact with the environment. Okay, so here's the basic question that I want to consider. Is there any real conclusive sort of fact of the matter about whether any of these assemblies of cells are the organism, or does it really depend more what questions we want to answer, which organisms we should single out? Okay, so let me just now specifically address promiscuous individualism, as I call it. Now, there's a relatively familiar case, where maybe if you're not biologists it won't be familiar, but for a long time plant scientists have realized that one of the things you often confront is you think you're in a wood, but actually an evolutionary biologist will say you're in a plant, because actually all the trees that you see are part of the same system, because the trees are just essentially root suckers from a first tree. So they're all genomically the same and they're all interconnected. So people say, well, that's just one individual, it just looks like a lot of trees. But of course, if you're, say, an ecologist, then you really want to count trees, because but 10 trees will support more woodpeckers than 5 trees, and so on. So the distinction here, the genet, which is the one organism, and the ramete, which is one bit of the organism that you want to distinguish from another one, is quite a familiar biological distinction. But I just want to point out, it's a case of what I call promiscuous individualism. How you sort out the world of biology into organisms depends on what you're interested in, the questions you want to ask. I want to suggest, though, that this what I've been talking about the, what I might call the universality of symbiosis, is something that raises a much deeper and more, pervasive problem about sorting out individuals. That there are components of the whole. The word, I got this funny word, holobiont, because a lot of symbiosis has been done by coral people, because they're famously interesting symbiosis, or probably because they're rather simple symbiosis that we can study quite well. And this is a term some coral biologists introduced to talk about the whole thing without using the term organism. Right. But so sometimes we want to talk about the life cycles of the things that make up the coral hull. Sometimes we want to talk about the coral. And these just seem to me different sort of entities, both perfectly real parts of the underlying biology, but parts that we distinguish for different reasons. Okay. So I want to suggest, and though this looks like a rather technical question, this is fundamental to the question about selfishness, about cooperation, is that symbiotic wholes may be quite typically the unit of selection. I mean, what gets selected, if it's sort of stupid and wanders over a cliff, is the whole cow, right? The whole cow goes over, and some of its bacterial symbionts might find another cow, but mostly the whole thing, you know, goes together. And I think quite typically, well, I think there is diversity in the fates, and certainly it may turn out for various reasons that genes in the system can carry on in all kinds of different ways. But on the whole, the thing that interacts with the environment and does its selectable thing is the symbiotic whole. And this seems to me to point to two different questions that quite generally have different, you know, ontologies that point to different kinds of organisms. Sometimes we're interested in lineages of cells. So if we're studying the cow, we might be very interested in the lineages that produced all these different kinds of microbes that live in the cow. And we might be interested in cow cell lineages. But if we're interested in what interacts with the environment, that what works as a whole, we have to look at the symbiotic whole. That seems to me what we should treat as the most fundamental organism, and is partly because we put evolution too centrally in the way we think about biology, that we tend to think of just the cow cells as the organism and the other stuff as just passengers. And that seems to me to really make no sense. And this is, I say, is crucial because, you know, evolutionary integrity is what basically drives arguments about what is a selfish individual. And if we start to break down our intuitions about what is a selfish individual, then we can just raise again the questions about what cooperates and what competes. And I think, you know, quite generally we should not assume that we have any strong intuitive sense about this. So I guess no, actually I thought I deleted this slide because this will take me much too long. But however, since I've got it, I'll just point out. This is sort of part of a philosophical picture that I've, you know, been trying to think about in a lot of ways, and these are some theses that I would defend quite generally in this philosophical picture. But I think I will just put them up there, and if anybody wants to complain about my not explaining them, I'll be happy to try and talk about them later. But they are kind of, each of them could deserve a full talk, so I won't try now. So what I want to do is get back to human groups. And really what I want to say, and I have to say here now that this is not a direct consequence of my arguments about microbes, but I want to suggest that, so the point about the promiscuous individualism is just to persuade you that it's not obvious what the individuals are, that there are many different ways we can break things down. And so we shouldn't take it as just obvious that you know, we know what the individuals are for every question. There are certainly questions for which, you know, either sense of the human individual is the right answer as a kind of individuals that we should be concerned about. And then there are other questions, perhaps, that they're not. So, first of all, I would say, of course, humans are, in terms of this hierarchy, they're just part of the hierarchy. And human groups are, I think, part of the hierarchy. Now here, I think actually it might have been good to have some nice pictures of beehives and termite mounds and familiar kinds of things in which other macrobes form multi-macrobial communities that look to me like individuals, that look like wholes that are, you know, that should be treated as units of selection, and as therefore things that, as the parts of them, are serving the good of the whole rather than their own selfish ends. And I just want to suggest that humans are part of this hierarchy, and I suggest that human groups are part of this hierarchy. Now, this, of course, is something I can't defend fully here. So I'm just trying to present a picture in which it makes perfect sense to think of that. And I guess what I want to suggest, and actually maybe that's why I should have dwelt on the larger theme, but I want to suggest that one criterion for this is that humans individually have properties that they would not have if they were not part of larger groups. And the most obvious example of that is language, which at least I think a lot of philosophers will agree is something that it doesn't even make sense. Professionals here will recognize my slightly Wittgensteinian roots, but that's not important. That it really doesn't make sense to think of language apart from being a property of a larger group, which individual members of that partake in. Now, I want to say, if there are properties which components of a whole have only because they're part of that whole, then there are questions for which the whole is the individual that you want to refer to. And I want to suggest that that's true for many questions about humans. Not all questions, not maybe some medical questions or physiological questions, but for many questions about human behavior, human culture, we need to look at the many different groups to which individual humans can belong, and for certain purposes see them as real. And if that's true, then the assumption that what humans are doing is always ultimately pursuing their self-interest is quite mistaken, because insofar as in certain contexts they're acting as part of wholes, then we should see them as acting in ways that promote the interests of the whole that they are in that respect part of. And so I think that if this is right, then that it simply becomes an empirical question what kind of arenas we should assume selfishness from this biological perspective on the human, and where we should not assume that at all. And so I want to say that Margaret Thatcher was quite wrong, and that any support she may have been thought to have been given from biology is quite mistaken, and there is such a thing as society. There are actually, I think, all kinds of social wholes that have a real existence and serve to explain what humans do sometimes. Now, this is another rather horrible looking slide, I apologize. But I think I will very quickly go through what I was thinking. So, and this really is just a programmatic kind of idea for how I would provide another strand for this same line of thought. And that is essentially saying, well, so why is it so natural for us to think humans just are individuals? Now, there are lots of answers that people give. They say, it feels like it, my consciousness is, something, and so on. But I actually want to suggest that there's a real historical contingency to this, and this is supposed to connect back to my suggestion. There's even a kind of ethnocentrism to it, that if we look at other places in space and time, we might find societies, I think we would find societies, in which it was much less natural and much more obvious that other larger entities should be taken quite seriously as the things that determine human behavior. That what you do is of course you do that because you're the chief, or because you're the, that's a way of thinking that just as, I do this because I'm the liver, and livers obviously don't think a lot, but if they did, they would not say, well, why don't you try and do down the kidneys? They would say, well, I'm just going to do my job as a liver. Now, so the sort of story would run, here's a very familiar starting point. If you look at the history of Western thought over the last 250 years or so, famously, social theory and biology have just swapped, their ideas backwards and forwards. So, Darwin famously was partially inspired by reading Malthus about competition among humans, about limited resources, and so on. Then this is a story about Darwin and forms of social Darwinism that fed back very diverse forms of social Darwinism that spread back into the social arena. I say very diverse because there were the kind of people we tend to think of as social Darwinists, but there are also Darwinian socialists, and I guess Marx and Engels, and Kropotkin actually sort of developed the idea in more detail. Another point that I want to say, and also because I don't want to sound as if I'm making a polemic against individualism, something one can easily forget, I only say that because I can easily forget it, so I don't know whether anybody else can, is that a lot of individualist philosophies have been made for progressive reasons, precisely to counteract oppressive, sort of state-centered ideologies. So, Mill's railing against convention, Nietzsche against the herd, people arguing against totalitarianism have often appealed quite appropriately to the perspective of the individual. But as I said, so sometimes one forgets that there was a history of individualism which took it as obvious that there was a real problem of the group, that the group certainly existed and that people didn't want to have all their behavior determined by the group. Now, I don't want to, I don't want now to make a position on the political philosophy here, just to point out that, it was once so obvious to think of humans as determined by larger social wholes, that individualism was actually originally, in many contexts, specifically an attack on that idea, and sometimes a very worthwhile one. So I guess the general conclusion is, if you look at this historical history, it starts to be much less obvious that it's just a natural thing to do to take the individual as fundamental. Whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing, it's an optional thing in the history of thought. And so I'm suggesting that the kind of abstract individualism that is assumed in so much social science now and apparently reinforced by biologists is something that kind of we can construct a sort of, we often tend to construct a sort of, as a Whig history, I don't know if Whig history is a term that translates very easily, but just a history which serves a particular legitimating function, rather than something that really takes proper account of the diversity of positions in the history of thought. Okay, finally, I just want to point out, obviously, that this is a set of thoughts that raise more questions than it answers, and that's good, because there's lots of work for other people and myself to carry on with. Some of the questions that I think particularly come to my mind is obviously one criticism that somebody is likely to make is, I want to talk about, say, the cow as an organism, well, why not call it just a sort of ecological system of interdependent, mutually interacting parts? And this raises a question which I think is very fundamental to contemporary biology, is one that's come in and out, and I think has come into biology in a more serious way perhaps than it ever has before, which is the question, okay, so let's not decide whether it's an organism, let's call it a system, because it's surely a system. Well, what is a system? And as I say, as more and more money in biology pours into systems biology, there is a lot of concern with that question, what is a system? What's this major new branch of biology about? And in fact, it's somewhat gratifying that systems biologists seem quite pleased to talk to philosophers, because they sometimes have a feeling that they're studying something but they don't know what it is, which perhaps is more common than that, but less generally recognized. Something that I skimmed by in that intermediate philosophical questions slide was something that bothers me a lot, and I guess I just say now, all the time when I talk about these biological things, I realize we're talking about very dynamic systems. We're not talking about sort of static things that we can describe. And I think this is a sort of, there's a nightmare here to me, which is if I go on talking about processes a lot, and this is sort of a kind of inside remark for professional philosophers, I'm afraid that I might have to try and understand Whitehead, and this is one of the worst things that can happen to a philosopher, as some of you will know. Maybe there are easier people, but most of the people who've talked about processes have ended up being very difficult to understand, and that maybe because it's very difficult to think about processes, so I'd like to try and avoid it, but I fear I can't. And finally, quite differently, as I've developed this idea towards kind of political ideas, I wonder, does it really make any difference? Does it have any force? Does it have rhetorical force? Does anybody believe it? Does it matter? No. And this is really something I've hardly begun to explore. So finally, really finally, some acknowledgements. I just make one point about these. I do work in a research centre with a large number of other people. And I do want to say, in illustration of my general thesis, that this paper would have been quite impossible for an isolated individual scholar, because whatever its merits, it derives from having input from a team of people, and I think perhaps this might be a valuable idea to promote in academic circles, because I think that some of the things we're dealing with nowadays, the most pressing kind of philosophical and scientific problems, actually require a lot of collaboration, and so we should maybe think of the research group as a real entity transcending the research individual. Perhaps scientists are inclined to do that already, humanists less so, but I encourage them to do so. So, thank you very much.
Do subito la parola a Alessandro Quattrone. Volevo solo ringraziare Paolo Costa della FBK per l'impeccabile traduzione delle slide che avete visto, che non era semplice, come avete potuto immaginare, e ricordare che questo incontro di Scienze e Società avviene in collaborazione con la FBK e il progetto Il futuro della vita umana. Ho detto giusto? Della natura umana. Alessandro.
No. In what language do you?
In italiano forse.
In italiano, ok.
In italiano forse.
Okay. Grazie molte professor Duprè per la sua relazione, molto interessante. Io vorrei aggiungere solo alcuni piccoli battoncini alla discussione, ho preso un po' di appunti, un po' di note mentre il professore parlava. A partire dalla cosa che ha detto abbastanza all'inizio, la difficoltà di definire le cose in biologia, in particolare di definire i geni. Ecco, questo dal mio punto di vista di tecnico, tale sono, è una cosa verissima. Vi faccio un esempio concreto. Negli ultimi 5-6 anni abbiamo scoperto che esistono dei geni che non fanno quello che pensavamo fare secondo la definizione classica i geni, cioè essere il substrato sul quale si generano, diciamo così, le proteine, che sono quegli enti che fanno le cose nelle cellule, che agiscono nelle cellule. Adesso sappiamo dell'esistenza di geni cosiddetti non codificanti, che non producono proteine, non coding genes, i quali geni sono circa il 70% del genoma. I geni che producono le proteine, che diciamo, contengono l'informazione del produrre le proteine, sono invece il 2-3%. Quindi questo vi dà un'idea di quanto poco ne sappiamo attualmente del contenuto proprio dei genomi e di quanta strada ancora va fatta. Ecco, perché dico questo? Perché il modo di definire qualcosa in biologia viene tipicamente, secondo l'attitudine delle scienze sperimentali, dalla operatività, dalla operazionalità. Quando appunto abbiamo capito che esistevano questi segmenti di codificanti ma non codificanti proteine, abbiamo capito che erano geni nel momento in cui abbiamo capito come interferivano, come si complementavano all'attività dei geni propriamente detti, dei geni classici. Quindi questo approccio operativo, che poi è proprio delle scienze fisiche, ovviamente, prima di quelle biologiche, in realtà i biologi sono fisici mancati, vorrebbero sempre più essere in qualche modo vicini affini alla fisica. È di fatto un approccio operazionale. Perché operazionale? Questo anche perché tendiamo sempre più, studiando la biologia, imparando cose nuove, sequenziando i genomi, a conferire un contenuto finalistico agli oggetti viventi, in primis alle cellule. E questo è, quando noi biologi facciamo i nostri corsi di biologia cellulare, ci scappa sempre di dire questo organolo serve a questo, fa questa cosa qua, oppure questo gene ha questa funzione. Ecco, purtroppo poi uno si corregge e dice no, non devo parlare in termini finalistici. Di fatto, questo è uno dei pilastri dell'intelligent design, tra l'altro, no? Su questo non discuterei, insomma, di fatto c'è un fortissimo contenuto di finalità nelle strutture viventi. E da qui poi alla fine forse deriva un po' il tema fondamentale dibattuto dal professor Duprè, quello della cooperazione o della competizione. Se non c'è una pulsione finalistica, chiaramente non ha molto senso neanche pensare a queste due altre categorie. Ora, è sicuramente un aspetto, un modo di vedere le cose che rischia di essere antropocentrico, un po' come rischia di esserlo l'impianto del selfish gene, del gene egoista. L'egoismo è un sentimento umano, l'egoismo già negli animali è un po' difficile da definire. Tuttavia non c'è dubbio che ci sono esempi fondamentali continui appunto di cooperazione, forse più cooperazione all'interno di gruppi di cellule che formano gli organismi e di competizione, anche in rapporto proprio ai batteri che popolano le nostre viscere, quelle delle mucche. Però ecco, sicuramente c'è questa fortissima tendenza, questo bisogno di spiegare le cose in termini appunto di attività che sono cooperative, sono competitive. Ecco, direi che sicuramente quello che stiamo imparando dalla biologia dei sistemi, da questi nuovi aspetti, anche i cambi di paradigma, potremmo dire, della biologia in anni recenti, è che c'è prima di tutto, più che qualunque cooperazione o competizione c'è nei sistemi viventi, e parliamo delle cellule prima di tutto, un altissimo livello di interconnessione. Questo è una cosa che non aspettavamo, ora ci è chiara, ma la complessità non tanto degli enti che popolano le cellule, che sono comunque decine di migliaia, ma delle interazioni che queste realizzano fra loro è enorme. E questo porta a quel concetto che a mio avviso dovrebbe essere veramente un argomento di grande interesse anche attuale per la filosofia della biologia, di robustezza, quello che si chiama robustezza, e che è poi un concetto che in qualche modo chiama direttamente in causa anche l'ingegneria. La robustezza deriva dal fatto che se noi alteriamo alcune componenti, eliminiamo alcuni geni di una cellula, la cellula neanche se ne accorge. La cellula ha dei modi con cui riesce a superare questa mancanza, ha dei circuiti di emergenza, come quelli di un aereo, no? Quelli di emergenza, ha dei circuiti ridondanti, ha un network cellulare sono ridondanti. E questo porta anche al concetto che cerchiamo di usare fra l'altro anche per curare il cancro adesso di synthetic lethality, di letalità sintetica. Sintetica è dalla radice greca shunk, nel senso di insieme, non di artificiale. Che in pratica deriva dal fatto che se si ledono contemporaneamente un certo numero di geni, in questo caso, si ha morte della cellula, ma soltanto un certo numero di geni esattamente quelli, mai uno soltanto. E questo dà un'idea della complessità strutturale e della robustezza funzionale degli esseri viventi, prima delle cellule e poi degli organismi che delle cellule si formano. E credo sia interessante su questo, proprio l'aspetto della robustezza, chiamare in causa un'altra disciplina emergente, parallela alla system biology, che è la synthetic biology, la biologia sintetica, cosiddetta. La biologia sintetica ha un'agenda che è veramente quasi incredibile, è quella di ricreare forme di vita, strutture viventi, ovviamente molto semplici d'origine, e lo fa con un approccio puramente ingegneristico. E qui siamo da capo al finalismo, perché se veramente si può immaginare di ricostruire forme viventi in modo minimale in modo peraltro più economico di quanto non faccia la natura, che è ridondante appunto, e vederle in azione, allora il concetto di finalismo assume un peso cartesiano, insomma un peso che per anni non abbiamo mai osato attribuire appunto, alla riflessione sulla biologia. È quello che si sta facendo, e vi cito, forse conoscete Clay Venter che sbandiera per i 420 queste attività, no, di genomi minimi, di organismi sintetici. In realtà Clay Venter ha molta pubblicità. Ci sono però persone che lavorano in questo campo, è uscito un lavoro l'anno scorso, che è passato abbastanza inosservato, ma un lavoro importante, nel quale si faceva il rewiring, proprio la reingegnerizzazione di un virus, quindi pseudo-organismo, nemmeno organismo, forma di vita, non vita, insomma intermedia, di batteri, una cosa molto semplice veramente, ma è stato ricostruito prendendo pezzi completamente differenti da quelli che costruiscono normalmente in natura questi batteriofagi cosiddetti, questi virus. Quindi si è ricostruito completamente un circuito di un batteriofago prendendo soltanto la logica costruttiva, non i singoli mattoni che lo compongono, si è preso mattoni equivalenti da altre forme di vita. E questo significa che lo si è capito, non c'è alcun dubbio che lo si sia capito, nel momento in cui si riesce a ricostruirlo. E questo ovviamente chiama in causa una serie di aspetti etici, filosofici, sociologici, non da poco, questo percorso che è in atto. Ecco, tornando invece al punto del professor Duprè che lui ha preso lo spunto appunto la distinzione tra organismi multicellulari e unicellulari, ha parlato appunto della pervasività degli organismi unicellulari, del fatto che si formano gruppi che non sono ancora organismi ma sono colonie organizzate, e quindi diciamo un forte elemento di cooperazione in queste attività, senza dubbio. Noi, il biologo, il macro, our definition of macro could be metazoa in certain sense, biologically speaking, multicellular organisms, metazoa we call them. Yeah. La distinzione appunto fondamentale tra organismi unicellulari e metazoa, organismi pluricellulari, mi ha fatto venire in mente un organismo in particolare, non è uno di quelli citati dal professor Duprè, ma è interessante proprio per capire nella pratica la cooperazione e la competizione come convivono. Si chiama Dictyostelium discoideum, the slime mold. È un fungo, un funghetto, molto piccolo, microscopico, e le cellule di questo fungo hanno una fase della vita libera, completamente indipendenti, sono quindi organismi unicellulari, dopodiché a un certo punto concorrono a formare un corpo fruttifero, quello tipico del fungo, e soltanto in certe fasi della vita, quando le condizioni ambientali lo permettono, e allora cooperano. Ecco, il genoma di questo Dictyostelium, rispetto a quello di altri funghi molto simili, ha delle parti espanse che sono quelle relative al comportamento sociale, diciamo così. Ci sono dei geni che codificano attività della cellula che non sono in nessun modo selfish, in nessun modo egoistiche, che diciamo servono a coordinare il comportamento sociale, quale cellula deve formare l'apice del corpo fruttifero, quale deve essere alla base e così via. Un gruppo di biologi americani ha fatto degli esperimenti banalissimi prendendo dei corpi fruttiferi di questi Dictyostelium un po' differenti, dei ceppi differenti, quindi i genomi erano leggermente differenti, non erano proprio uguali, erano la stessa specie ma delle razze differenti, diciamo, e li hanno combinati variamente fra loro. Ecco, a quel punto il comportamento altruistico, inizialmente altruistico, quello codificato nel genoma del Dictyostelium, è diventato un comportamento competitivo. Cioè, quando le cellule che componevano il Dictyostelium erano chimeriche, venivano da ceppi differenti, non riuscivano a parlarsi e anzi si davano noia in qualche modo fra loro. Quindi, ecco, è una moneta a doppia faccia, no? La competizione può diventare, la collaborazione può diventare competizione in certe specifiche circostanze, in certi specifici contesti ambientali. Quindi non vediamo troppo in biologia come attività divaricate, dicotomiche e contrapposte, sono attività di interazione, sia la cooperazione che la competizione, e usano spesso lo stesso tipo di codice chimico per attuarsi. Questa era l'altra riflessione. Non c'è dubbio che il mondo sia degli organismi unicellulari, sia e poi degli organismi inferiori. Ecco, questo è l'altro concetto che volevo aggiungere, no? L'idea che nell'evoluzione delle specie si sia passati da organismi molto semplici a organismi molto complessi, e l'uomo è l'apice della complessità, è negata da evidenze di vario genere, da evidenze microbiologiche, da evidenze paleontologiche. È, diciamo, un'idea ancora una volta antropocentrica, finalistica nel senso peggiore del termine, cioè che vede il cammino della vita convergere verso un fine di aumento di complessità e di tripudio nell'invenzione della specie umana. Thomas Morgan, un genetista del secolo passato, del primo del secolo passato, un grande genetista, alla domanda, Thomas Morgan era un credente, alla domanda se cosa ci spiega di Dio l'evoluzione, rispose che deve avere una passione per i coleotteri, perché ci sono 20.000 specie di coleotteri. E possiamo dire, avete visto lo schema che ha mostrato il professor Duprè sull'albero della vita, ci sono gli archea. Gli archea sono degli organismi molto semplici, unicellulari, che fino a ancora 15 anni fa noi mettevamo insieme ai batteri. Sono completamente diversi dai batteri, sono anzi molto più diversi dai batteri di quanto i batteri non siano diversi da noi a livello di genoma. E sono adattati a ambienti estremi, sono estremofili, vivono nei vulcani sottomarini, in zone molto calde oppure in zone molto acide, e hanno un sistema completamente differente a tutti i livelli. Quindi sicuramente i trionfatori della Terra sono i batteri, gli archea, forse anche i coleotteri, e certamente non i mammiferi. Ecco, dicevo, il complesso, il semplice versus complesso. Questo è il successo, insomma, è un chiaro esempio di come questo non sia così vero, perché se dobbiamo capire come definire complesso. Il numero di geni, non va bene il numero di geni, il nostro numero di geni è inferiore a quello dei granchi, noi pensiamo di essere più furbi dei granchi. La regolazione anche lì c'è qualche problema, la nostra regolazione è più complessa. Sicuramente c'è stato nella storia della vita un momento, l'esplosione precambriana cosiddetta, un momento di molti milioni di anni fa, nella quale si è avuto nell'ambito dei vertebrati proprio, dei prevertebrati e dei vertebrati, un'esplosione di forme architettoniche, una trentina di forme, di cui adesso conserviamo solo 4. Quindi anche lì c'è stato un momento di produzione della complessità che poi si è in qualche modo incuneata verso una serie di forme, non sappiamo perché, delle quali una è quella dei vertebrati attuali, quindi anche dei mammiferi. E qui c'è un bellissimo libro, se non l'avete letto, non sapete, di Stephen Jay Gould, Wonderful Life, tradotto in italiano, che racconta proprio la storia di come l'idea dell'aumento di complessità abbia vanificato per un grande paleontologo dell'epoca la possibilità di capire questo giacimento di fossili di Parkes in Canada, perché le nostre idee ovviamente influenzano moltissimo la capacità di vedere la verità scientifica almeno. Ecco, volevo aggiungere soltanto una cosa, che sicuramente è informativo analizzare cercare di usare una lente appunto una lente filosofica sulla biologia attuale in particolare, per capire qualcosa anche della società umana. È sicuramente prima di tutto lecito e può portare anche a delle informazioni interessanti, a un modo di vedere le cose abbastanza interessante. È però viziato sempre dal fatto che noi giudichiamo in qualche modo, ci deve essere un isomorfismo insomma, fra le strutture dei viventi e quello che noi chiamiamo società umana, che non è detto. In passato sappiamo bene, mentre quando gli scienziati si rivolgevano alle scienze sociali di allora, Darwin con Malthus, con il saggio sulle popolazioni, questo poi era l'acquisizione di nuovi schemi di pensiero che andavano poi provati nella prassi della ricerca sperimentale, in fondo anche quella darwiniana era una ricerca sperimentale. Viceversa sappiamo di Wast che ha prodotto l'applicazione di modelli bassamente finalistici, biologici, pseudobiologici alle scienze sociali, alla politica, alla filosofia. Lysenko è un esempio clamoroso, il genetista Lysenko in Russia. Quindi voglio dire, la sociobiologia, ecco, una delle ultime mode derivate dalla biologia, osservare le comunità di insetti doveva dare delle informazioni fondamentali sulla natura umana in Wilson. Io credo che ci occorre stare estremamente attenti a questo, mentre la riflessione filosofica sulla biologia è importante per aiutare i biologi a comprendere meglio la vita, il viceversa credo che debba essere accuratamente considerato e pesato.
Domande da parte vostra? È possibile fare domande in italiano? Le traduciamo, professor Duprè.
Provare a farlo in inglese. I have philosophical curiosity. I don't know whether it is relevant or not, but if I understand you correctly, your stance amounts to a plea for pluralism. So, what about reality after that? Do we need the concept? What are the implications for our conception of reality?
Well, as I said, when I produced this kind of pluralistic argument about species, I called it promiscuous realism. And so I guess it is my conviction that it is useful to have a concept of reality. Now, it's certainly true that many people have said to me since that my position is not realist at all. It's many other non-realist positions, but not realist. I guess my sort of rather naive, perhaps, sounding reason for insisting on the realism is just that I think there's a tendency for people to equate the pluralism with a view that anything that we care to construct is as good as anything else. And certainly what I wanted to say about classification is that there were many ways of classifying things, but there had to be some reason for doing it that was reflected in something about the way things are, or let's say reality. And I suppose I want to say the same thing about distinguishing individuals. There is not a unique way that biology tells us we have to distinguish individuals, but it isn't as if, you know, we could do it any way we want and just carve, you know, cubes out of, you know, kind of biological systems and say that's an individual or that. So I guess it's just to hang on to the idea that the pluralism is driven by the science rather than just driven by, you know, anything we feel like. And now maybe that's a rather simplistic conception of realism, but at any rate it's the kind of thought makes me try and insist on hanging on to the word realism and having to hang on to reality. So.
No, well, I think I have a question to the last part of your lecture. The one in which you were saying that somehow the whole is an individual. And it seems to me that one should distinguish really at which level we are talking about. Because or else if the whole is an individual, then the individual is a whole, and it becomes a bit ambiguous. I mean, I think that if one doesn't distinguish clearly at which level one is talking, we might say, of course, that that I am a multimicrobial community, okay, and as such, being a whole, I am an individual. But still, this multimicrobial community, as you were saying, is composed by other units that one could also call in.
Yes.
That's all. And this is one aspect. And instead invece, professor Quattrone, devo dire, ho apprezzato molto quanto tu hai detto alla fine a proposito di quello che io chiamo queste analogie biopolitiche con le quali bisogna fare molta attenzione, e cioè è bellissimo, ha una funzione sicuramente didattica utilizzare ovviamente sia il concetto di competizione come il concetto anche di cooperazione, però è chiaro che nell'uso che ne facciamo sia cooperazione sia competizione presentano una intenzionalità che noi attribuiamo a degli organismi viventi, e questa intenzionalità sinceramente mi lascia molto perplesso, no? Quindi questa attenzione all'uso di vocaboli del genere utili, didattica, anche euristicamente utile nel corso dell'Ottocento per capire delle cose, anche del Novecento, però giustamente hai ricordato, ha portato anche a delle catastrofi. L'isenco è un caso a livello scientifico, ma quelli precedenti degli anni 30 sono ancora peggiori. Quindi questo sono.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I understood the concern, but it may be that I didn't make myself clear. I certainly I want to say there are individuals at many different levels, so that the individuals of which a larger individual is composed may certainly be individuals that would be the individuals we would want to distinguish for some different purpose. Now, if I were to pursue this further, I would have to go back to the slide that I went over too quickly. And I guess what I would want to say is that when I say that the higher level individual, let's say the human group to be as controversial as possible, is a real individual, what I really mean is that I think it has causal powers, that it causally affects the world, not merely as the sum of the causal effects of the individuals that make it up. And in particular, the real mark of that is that it causally, it explains, I don't say causes, but that its behavior explains the behavior of its constituents. But that I would take much more. But what I'm saying is that there is something, there's quite a kind of clear requirement, at least I would like to make it clear, as to what is involved in saying that the more complex, higher level whole is an individual. But it certainly is not as a, what I want to specifically deny is there are particular levels, sort of privileged levels at which we find the individuals. and then other levels are somehow subordinate, so that the monogenomic cell community is a sort of privileged individual and has a reality that other kinds of communities of cells don't have. So is that clear?
I also have a short question. You mentioned your interest for the political implications of defining an individual.
Yes.
And I would like to ask you what kind of cases you have in mind. I mean, is it something like, is a pregnant mother an individual, or is the individual formed by her and her baby? Is this, or it's a dying patient attached to a machine, still an individual?
To be perfectly honest, I haven't thought about that very much, but I think that might be, that potentially is a very interesting application, and certainly I would very much be inclined to the view you suggest, that the notion that we clearly see two individuals, the mother and the baby or the fetus, is based on the kind of naive, I know it when I see it, the view of the individual, so I'd be very sympathetic to that application, which indeed would be politically quite contentious.
And legally also.
Yes, indeed. But I would certainly be very tempted to agree with that. I guess I was thinking more of a rather more kind of macro-political questions about the kind of assumption in kind of rational choice theory, classical economics, that these must be the way to think about society, because we know in the end everybody is an individual agent pursuing their own good. But that's a more obvious. But I'm quite taken with your suggestion.
Mi chiedo una cosa, si è parlato di contenuto finalistico delle cellule, degli organismi. Ora, voglio dire, da che cosa si capisce che c'è questo finalismo? Perché qua è facile sovrapporre una concezione, diciamo così, filosofica, eccetera, che qua invece deve essere esclusa assolutamente. E questo, comunque, qual è il contenuto eventualmente di questo finalismo? Sono due, perché altrimenti qua cadiamo sostanzialmente nel disegno intelligente, per così dire, cosa che credo dobbiamo escludere assolutamente. Quindi queste due, vuol dire che sono state fatte le domande anche di tipo filosofico, quindi per così dire allora cadiamo nel discorso dell'evoluzionismo contro il creazionismo sostanzialmente, no? Un tema peraltro attuale, ma che la biologia in sé per sé credo dovrebbe essere astrarsi da questa visione. Grazie.
Certo, sì, posso rispondere esattamente con l'ultima frase che lei ha usato? Sono perfettamente d'accordo, la biologia deve estrarre da queste considerazioni. Per quanto mi riguarda sono un evoluzionista, in quanto biologo è difficile non essere evoluzionisti ed essere biologi al tempo stesso, biologi sperimentali, ma questa è un'opinione. Il finalismo, per come lo intendo in quel contesto in cui l'ho collocato, la parola finalismo, poi sono sempre pericolosi, ma il finalismo si attua nella capacità delle macchine cellulari di eseguire delle azioni e di fare delle azioni coordinate che poi hanno un esito ben identificabile. Noi possiamo far parlare della macchina cellulare come di un ingranaggio, per quello che ne sappiamo, estremamente complesso, che ha delle componenti sicuramente di funzionamento stocastico, ma che poi alla fine produce un risultato che è sempre più o meno quello, in funzione degli stimoli anche ambientali. Quindi in questo senso la spiegazione, la delucidazione della biologia cellulare fa pensare appunto a un finalismo. Dico macchine in modo molto attento, non parlo delle macchine appunto cartesiane, della filosofia nel Settecento un filosofo inglese dette il famoso argomento dell'orologio, no? A prova dell'esistenza di Dio. Uno cammina per un prato, vede un orologio, dice questa cosa diversa da quella che vede intorno, ha una finalità, uno scopo. Ecco, non è quello. La macchina cellulare compie delle azioni coordinate e che producono un esito il cui contenuto, ancora una volta, è quello del carattere fondamentale, è quello della robustezza. Faccio un altro esempio. Il nostro contenuto di cellule del sangue è prodotto dalla trasformazione, dal differenziamento a partire da un tipo cellulare unico, staminale, di un certo numero di tipi cellulari. Ecco, ciascuno di questi tipi è in quella quantità precisa, deve essere mantenuto durante la vita dell'individuo in quella quantità precisa. Un sistema che è abbastanza fluttuante, abbastanza stocastico se vogliamo, alla fine produce questo effetto. In quel senso lì intendo finalismo, senza connotati filosofici.
Bene, io credo che possiamo concludere e ringrazio il professor Duprè ancora per il suo intervento, il professor Quattrone per essere intervenuto come discussant, ringrazio Francesca Michelini e Paolo Costa della FBK con cui abbiamo organizzato questo seminario e vi do appuntamento al 3 dicembre, ultimo di questo anno solare, e si parlerà di eugenetica tra scienza e politica con Francesco Cassata, che è un giovane storico molto bravo che ha appena pubblicato un libro su questo argomento.